All right, good afternoon, everyone. And I'm Tom Brake, the Director of Unlock Democracy, but I'm here today as the co-partner with the New Europeans in a campaign to try to secure overseas constituencies for the UK. And why are we trying to do this? We're trying to do this because in my experience as a former Member of Parliament, UK citizens who live abroad are not very well represented by their existing members of parliament. Now, I don't think that's because existing members of parliament are not particularly interested in the UK citizens who live abroad. I think it's because they, on the whole, have had very little experience of dealing with the issues, the thorny issues that UK citizens abroad often face. Why are we campaigning on this issue now? As many of you will be aware, the government have, through the Elections Act, changed the law, and they have changed the law so that probably from the beginning of next year, every single UK citizen living abroad will be eligible to vote in UK elections. And that's not, at the moment, it's just people who've lived abroad for up to 15 years. And this extension will ensure that everyone who is a UK citizen living abroad will be able to vote in elections. So that's why I think this campaign is particularly timely. And so what does the campaign that we're pushing for consist of? Well, perhaps before I do that, I should just outline what overseas constituencies are or how it might work in terms of a model. Now, there are currently, I believe, 17 countries around the world that have MPs who represent parts of abroad, who are representing their citizens in their respective national parliaments, the French, the Italians, and so on. And how many MPs represent those citizens abroad varies a bit between different countries, but I would expect that were the UK to adopt this model, something like perhaps 10 members of parliament representing overseas constituencies, that might be the order of magnitude, with perhaps a couple of 2 or 3 MPs representing Europe, and two possibly representing Australia, New Zealand, one representing the US, one representing Asia, and so on. I think the numbers would have to be determined by a process that the Boundary Commission would probably have to undertake. So we can't be too precise on the numbers. It would be possible, for instance, to keep the size of Parliament as it is now, so 650 MPs, and reduce the number of MPs representing UK constituencies. But I suspect that the simplest way forward would be to add to the existing constituencies, so that you would go from 650 to say 660 MPs in the UK Parliament. Now, the cost associated with this, of course, there is a cost if you're adding to the number of members of Parliament. Then at a rough guesstimate, and it is a guesstimate, I think we came up with a figure of about 350,000, and that is the MP's salary, the salaries of their staff, because they'd have to be staff like any other MP, and they would need to have a constituency office which might be located in one of the major countries that they represent abroad, and they'd probably have a slightly more generous travel allowance than existing UK members of Parliament, because the need to travel backwards and forwards between the region they were representing in the world and the UK Parliament. So there would be a cost, but I believe, and I think there's strong support for this from UK citizens living abroad, that this would be a much more effective way of having their views represented. And we will be getting at, I hope, our next meeting, or possibly the one after that, either a French member of Parliament who represents an overseas constituency, or perhaps an Italian member of Parliament, to set out how they do their job, and why, in their view, this is more effective way of representing foreign citizens or their citizens living abroad than the UK's arrangement for representing UK citizens abroad. Now, this is I guess, a fairly typical campaign in terms of the things that we are doing. So we are putting pressure on parliamentarians, some of whom I'm pleased to say support our cause. So we're very pleased that we got Lord Renard with us today, who is very much a supporter of this measure, as are the Liberal Democrats more generally in terms of this being party policy. And there are also supporters within the other parties. And clearly this campaign is about encouraging them to be more outspoken in their support, and also to work with other parliamentarians who are not yet supportive to try and sell this concept to them. We are doing work with the media, and we've got a little bit of coverage on this recently, particularly in the press abroad as opposed to the UK press. And we are doing the sorts of things you'd expect in terms of providing, we provided a pro forma letter that people can use to lobby their existing member of parliament, or the person who, if they've lived outside the UK for more than 15 years, will become their next member of parliament. I suppose the final thing I would say, just in terms of the opportunities that we have to press this. Now, the expectation is there will be a change of government, that we're expecting an election in May or October. It looks likely that that might be a Labour government, or certainly a Labour-led government. That doesn't seem to be in much doubt at present. Now, the Labour Party has recognised that there is something wrong with our democracy, and that Westminster isn't working. Something, incidentally, that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has also recognised. So there does seem to be a willingness to entertain the idea of reform. And whilst neither the Conservatives nor the Labour Party have talked about including anything to do with overseas constituencies in their manifestos, what we have got from Labour is the prospect of them introducing legislation for votes at 16 and 17, and also introducing votes for people living in the UK who are UK residents but are not currently eligible to vote. So there will be an opportunity at least to enter into some wider discussions about representation. And I hope that there'll be opportunities also perhaps to table amendments to the relevant bills if a Labour government comes forward with these bills. And indeed, some of them may even be in order. For those of you who understand parliamentary terminology, you can sometimes table amendments that are, frankly, never going to be debated because they're not within the scope of the bill, or you can table amendments which are pertinent to the bill and could theoretically lead to a debate about them, and even possibly a vote. So I think there will be opportunities certainly to put forward amendments that could at least be raised during debate, even if they weren't sort of formally tabled and voted on. But there might indeed also be some perhaps more formal opportunities. And it may be that when we move on in this meeting, that perhaps Lord Renard may be able to elucidate us a bit on that point. But I think that those were the key points I wanted to make about overseas constituencies. I think this is a campaign that is timely. It's a campaign where there will be opportunities, particularly if there's a change of government and a focus on some electoral reform, to bring these issues forward. And in the meantime, we need to create I think the public support for this to make it happen. And just that the final point I would make is that I was very pleased today that I got an email asking me if I would meet the International Consortium of British Pensioners who are visiting London on the 20th of November. I'm very happy to do that. And clearly they are a group who would be particularly interested, and I hope supportive of this proposal. Because if there's one thing that I remember from being a member of Parliament, I did occasionally get representations from UK citizens living abroad on the subject of pensions. So if those views could be more effectively represented in Parliament by MPs whose job it was to understand the implications for UK pensioners abroad, then I think that would be a very good thing. So that's my piece, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much, Tom. So actually, before I turn on to Lord Renard, let me add some points from my perspective also. So my name is Ruvi Ziegler. I'm in my day job an associate professor in international refugee law at the University of Reading, but for my sins also the chair of New Europeans UK, which, as Thomas mentioned, is running this particular campaign. And I want to add to different points that Tom has been covering. I think when we do this campaign, we will come across the obvious sort of response, which is, this is the way things have been running. Why are you changing them? People are represented by the last place they've lived, because there is a constituency link. And the reality is that even before the 15-year rule has been repealed by the Election Act 2022, that argument was quite weak in my view, based precisely on the sort of points that Tom has made. The ability, the lack of expertise, accessibility, language capacities, and all of the other elements that make an MP's job possible when they represent constituents in a territorially linked space. Those are all much weaker when it comes to people who live abroad, even short term. But this is magnified by the removal of the 15-year rule. So New Europeans has been a long supporter of that removal, and that has happened, and that will kick in. And so to some extent, the important point about this campaign is that it is not as such a campaign to change the electorate. So individuals involved will be enfranchised. And the question is, where are they best represented? Are they best represented at a place they may have, in fact, never lived, but had some sort of a link, tenuous link that would be the way in which the current system will link them to a specific UK constituency, or are they better represented as they are, as Tom said, in a number of other European countries, but also countries in all continents, in fact, by specialized constituencies that are regionally based, and there will be able to much better align their interests and ensure the representation. It also, in our view, would lead to a much simpler registration, or potentially to a much simpler registration process, if we are in a position to say that rather than trying to tie what will inevitably a much, much larger number of people, because of the removal of the 15-year bar, to each of the 650 constituencies in each electoral campaign, we would be able to create a database of people who live in that geographical region and tie registration to that area. So even on that level, that seems to us to be a very welcome development. And we can think about people living in different regions of the world. Particularly, we have on the call as well people who live on the continent, the European continent, and given the specific challenges that arise from the UK's departure from the European Union, it is very clear that the ability to address those effectively for an MP or a series of MPs who would be residing potentially, or at the very least representing only people who reside on the European continent, is very different than the ability of 650 MPs to represent a very small number in each of one of those constituencies of people scattered around the EU. I would even say it's a very inefficient way of addressing a concern that is the concern of people who live in a certain geographical area, to spread the dealing with that issue across 650 constituencies. So for all these reasons, I think the change cannot come soon enough, in my view. I'd also want to say something about, Tom talked about the number of people or the number of MPs that we're looking to see. And I think here it kind of is tied back to the question of registration and the registration drive, as you were, because the model I think that we came up with was that it would make sense to have a two-stage process where we would first have a big registration drive. To some extent, there was a registration drive under the previous rule in the last 10 years on 2 occasions, and the largest number of people registered was, I've looked through the parliamentary briefing, was in June 2017, was 285,000 people, and that was in the that was registration recorded then, but it was in the lead up to the election in 2017, and there was a similar large number in December 2019. So before each election, there is a registration drive, but those are still low numbers, and the voting turnout is also lower than amongst the territorial UK population. So my view, at least, or the Europeans' view, is that it would be right that if the electorate is bigger, that there should be additional MPs rather than come at the expense of existing MPs. Because if you have a country, instead of 50 million electorates, you have 52 million or 53 million, then you would need more MPs to represent so that you don't reduce the number of MPs per constituency. But we will need to see what registration looks like. And so ideally, once the secondary legislation is in place, hopefully next year at the beginning of the year, I think there should be pressure, in addition to the wider campaign that we talk about in terms of overseas constituencies. There should also be pressure to make sure as many people as are eligible are registered, because that would give us an indication, and would also, I think, make the case a stronger case, because the UK government actually estimates that there might be as many as 3.5 million people who would be eligible to be registered. So that's the adult population, of course, more than that, British citizens who live abroad. But we know from history that not everybody registers, and if registration seems complicated or inaccessible, they're less likely to do it. So that, I would say, complements Tom's point about the campaign. One, I think, strand of that campaign is to emphasize the importance of registration and to press on those who are involved in registration to ensure that it's done in a proper way. The final point.
Can I just ask one question, just to interrupt you? Sorry. The point of registration is to ensure that you get a vote. Yes?
Sure.
And it's that only, is it?
Well, so as I said, at least my own view is that at the moment we are operating with a system where everybody would be eligible, but their vote will be at their existing constituency.
Yeah. There's a separate reason for me asking that question, because one of the issues is that the UK government doesn't know where its citizens are.
That's right.
And I think that is a major problem for people. And there are a lot of people living certainly within France, on their own, who are now elderly.
Right.
And when people become ill and die and have no relatives, the mairie carries out the functions that are necessary, but he doesn't know who to report the deaths of these people to, because there is no process in place.
Yeah. So
there's the importance of registration, not only for voting, but to let the UK government know where people are.
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I agree with that entirely. I think
Brexit showed it up. Brexit showed it up exactly, because when the British Embassy in Paris was trying to notify people about the amendments and things that were going to happen, they had to go to insurance agents to find out if they had British clients, and then to talk to them that way. They had no idea where people were.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just to add, I mean, there are circumstances where the UK government does actually seek that information. So at the moment, they are asking British citizens who live in Israel to register that they are in Israel. So
a week after the French have taken their citizens out of danger.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. And I agree with you. And I think in that sense, there is a wider interest here in having a registration drive. But I suppose my kind of additional point to that, and I agree with all you say, but I think the additional point is that if we have a successful registration drive, then we will have a much better indication also of how a possible allocation of overseas constituency should take place, and to be able to press that, as Tom says, for the next parliament as part of the opening up of whatever changes there are to the electoral system in this country.
And that registration drive would have the effect of making the UK government aware of a far larger number of UK citizens living abroad.
Absolutely.
Because they would have a register that tells them where they are.
Absolutely. So I just wanted as a very final point to say that Todd's mentioned the involvement of people from different political parties, and it is important I think for both of our organizations, but more generally to say that, of course, this isn't from our perspective a party political point. It is a point about representation. We want British citizens who live abroad, whatever their age, whatever their profession, wherever they are, to be properly represented. I have no idea which party, if at all, will benefit from this, and I think that should never be a consideration that we take into account. Maybe an obvious point to be making, but I think it's an important point of principle to make. So that's what I wanted to say. Gunnar, would you like to?
I might say a couple of words, if I may, as I'm here, and obviously I'm very supportive of this campaign. And I might say, by way of introduction, when I started arguing for this in the House of Lords a little while ago, the whole idea of overseas constituencies was virtually unknown amongst the other parties. They had no idea how the French sensibly organised this, for example. So it was new to them, but they weren't necessarily against it when they actually thought about it. But thinking about it actually takes a step they don't necessarily always take. In terms of actually making this happen, I agree obviously with what Tom was saying earlier on, but I think very much the prospect of this happening depends on whether the next government wants to deal again with boundary reorganisation issues. Now, most of the opposition parties oppose the way in which boundaries are drawn for UK constituencies, principally because they leave out so many people who should be registered to vote and who are not included. But exactly these arguments apply for UK citizens living overseas. And if they're going to do something about boundary organisation and voter registration, and I think a Labour government would be minded in that direction, and things like automatic voter registration would be crucial to Labour actually thinking they want a system in which everybody is registered to vote to give them a better chance in future, to put it crudely. So if there's a boundary organisation bill at some point in the next Parliament, then that's the point to lobby for the overseas constituencies in Parliament. In the meantime, you have to think about how people will be interested in this, and a lot of people are not who should be, but there's a very strong lobby, which I see George and others I know will be very familiar with, on the frozen pensions issue. Now, at the minute, MPs Postbags does register a smattering at least of people writing to them, raising the issue of their frozen pensions and unfairness. What I think we need to do is, with that campaign in particular, to get people to be writing to MPs saying, well, we want something done about our frozen pensions, but we want to be properly represented. And we know, writing to you, with all your many constituents and different diverse problems, you're not thinking immediately about those of us in Australia who've paid for a pension and are not getting it. But if we had a handful of constituencies, that's all we ask, there would be people dedicated to raising the issues that particularly affect us. Now, that campaign, at least in part, is run by a public affairs company called Tendo Consulting, who I know extremely well. A guy called Peter Carroll is the head person on this. He came up with a brilliant idea a little while ago, but I had to tell him when he rang me it was completely flawed. He thought you could get everybody registering overseas all to register in the Prime Minister's constituency. And if suddenly you've got tens of thousands of people registering in the Prime Minister's constituency, you would get attention on this matter. But while we don't know the details yet, of course, I had to tell him, no, the principle agreed is that it'll be your last address in the UK where you're registered to vote. Yeah. But changing MPs' postbags on this issue, raising awareness and pointing out in particular to Labour, but also all the opposition parties, boundary organisation, automatic voter registration and doing something about the registration of UK citizens overseas with the appropriate constituencies should be on their agenda. And unless this is thought about and planned before polling day, it won't be happening. I'll finish on this note. Before 97, I was the joint secretary of a consultative committee which met between Labour and Lib Dems, chaired by Robert McLennan and Robin Cook jointly, with me as the joint secretary, with Pat McFadden, who's now a Labour MP and significant player in the Labour Party. And we were trying to say, look, we've got between us all these ideas for if the Conservatives lose a majority, what are we then going to do on constitutional issues? Because we have lots of ideas, lots of things we want to do, and we try to do them all together, nothing will happen. What we need to do is timetable various things that needed to happen. So we had quick agreement on some things, like incorporation to UK law of the EHCR, and for referendums for the Scottish Parliament and what was then the Welsh Assembly, and proportional representation for the European Parliament elections. And from 97 to 99, that worked brilliantly. And almost everything that we agreed happened, and all the things where we didn't quite agree on didn't happen, but we had a plan. The problem was Blair by 99 lost interest in this. Doing some of the big things required more than 2 years, but he'd lost interest by then. What we need, in my view, is the opposition parties all thinking, okay, over a 5-year parliament, these are all the things we will be able to agree on and work together on. PR might be divisive, but overseas constituencies is a very good one, especially as Tom indicates, it's a small number. My discussions with some Labour friends in the House of Lords was brilliant idea, but if there are 3.5 million people,
right,
and you say, okay, for every 69,000, 76,000 of them, they need a seat, we can't go along with that. And I said, no, it's got to be a clearly defined limited number. And if it's limited, Tom was suggesting 10, I'm not quite sure the figure comes from, but a consensus amongst us on the figure and agreement on the costs would, I think, make it possible to think about doing this in the next Parliament.
Can I also, I'm sorry to keep jumping in, but there's another issue here that might help us, and that is, at the moment, am I correct in thinking that registration is technically a political issue? Whereas if it came in under the heading of duty of care, it is a non-political issue, because every government has a duty of care to its citizens wherever they are in the world.
I would say that in terms of electoral legislation, and that's what this is about, electoral and constitutional legislation, that will be considered entirely separately from whatever the DWP or the NHS or any other government agency will do. Electoral registration is actually run not nationally, as perhaps it might be, and is in some countries. It's run by 450 local authorities, according to rules and standards set by Parliament. But those local authorities registering their voters are not going to focus on the care needs of people living overseas. I'm sorry, that's just the...
No, I was talking about separate registration because it's a way of coming in round the back door.
Okay, but I can tell you, although this is the case, it won't happen. It will not affect electoral legislation. And if we're trying to do something all-encompassing to try and get 3.5 million people all registered for healthcare, pension rights, etc., and so on, we are weakening very considerably the case we might be making for overseas constituencies.
Right.
It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I've got a question as well, but I see there's I see Jenny's got her hand up. Then Tom wants to say a couple things. Then I've got one question. So Jenny, do you want to come in? Jenny, you need to unmute, Jenny.
That was
Jenny, we can't hear you. You need to put your microphone on.
Let's try that again. It was building on the question of getting the existing MPs to acknowledge that they have got overseas-based constituents.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, and I get crosser about this every time I look, frankly, across the board, if you go and look at MPs' websites, you will see them, as we know, talking about the fact that they are there to represent their constituents. you know, and that they're only allowed to do certain things for their constituents, and there are limitations on this. Actually, they don't talk about constituents, they talk about residents. They talk about residents in their geographic area in the UK. And to my shame, I have to tell you that this also applies to MPs of the party that I support.
Yeah.
And that is something that seems to me to be wholly unacceptable, and the province perhaps of, is there a way in which we can press for a standard relating to, at the very least, acknowledging the duty, going back to Sarah's useful word, yeah, duty of care towards all constituents, regardless of where they live. Because if you go and look at this, and I can offer examples, but I wouldn't bother reading it, it'll just make you cross.
Yeah.
Where it speaks to this whole issue of they don't think we're anything to do with them.
Yeah, but I think, you know,
I crossed the channel in 2013 and I disappeared, basically.
Yeah.
I disappeared out of reckoning from the people who represent me. I've just now got the guy in the constituency where I have a vote to actually reply to me occasionally. And I don't pester him very often. I know the chap quite well. But on a couple of key issues, and he sent me an email the other day for the first time in about 2 years. Yeah, but
maybe.
I think there is a standards issue here in terms of how MPs behave. And one last thing, which I found fundamentally shocking and really annoyed me amazingly, during the committee stage of discussing the Elections Act, this question was raised. George may recognise the conversation where we raised the question in our representations about the failure of MPs across all parties to acknowledge their duty towards dealing with overseas-based constituents. And the minister at the time said, of course they do. That's nonsense. It doesn't happen. So there is a real problem there. I would like to see, in addition to other issues going more long term, us press that button saying we need that standard to change so that it is inclusive, not discriminatory. Because that's the word I've started using now. I'm discriminated against because of where I live,
yeah,
as an elector, and I don't like it and I won't put up with it. And it's that kind of side of things that maybe we need to press in terms of campaigning, but we also need to look to see whether or not there are any parliamentary related means by which MPs can have it made clear to them that they do have that duty to be inclusive, not exclusive.
Thank you.
Okay, so just a couple of responses first of all. So on your point, Jenny, as it happens, Unlock Democracy are looking at preparing a job description for members of Parliament, which could include ensuring that MPs represent all voters on the register for their constituency. So to make it clear that anyone who is on the register is someone that MP should be representing. So that might address your concern. Sarah's point, if, for instance, there was a campaign run by somebody that was trying to ensure that every UK citizen living abroad had to be registered with the Foreign Office with a view to helping them should there be a crisis or a disaster, then I think that is the sort of campaign that we would want to swing behind.
Yeah.
It's not, however, a campaign that I think we have the capacity to run ourselves. So we can swing behind it, certainly. Yeah, and just on the registration drive and the automatic voter registration point, again, Unlock Democracy, we're working with Operation Black Vote around a registration drive, and we have already raised with them, well, don't forget overseas citizens as part of your registration drive to try to include them in it. And we've talked about the same thing for AVR, automatic voter registration. So in other words, don't forget to make sure that in interactions that UK citizens living abroad that they have with the passport office. For instance, if you're introducing automatic voter registration, it should also link up with UK citizens abroad so that they have at least a prompt that says, really, you should go on the register.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say, to ask Lord Bernard, but it kind of partly builds on Jenny's point about MPs seeing their jobs as residence-based, because if it is the case that Labour will try to change the franchise to include at least long-term residents, and as I say, New Europeans capacity actually supports that. I think we will need to be able to articulate. I think there are good responses to this, but we'll need to articulate why the two things are not mutually exclusive. In other words, why the fact that the franchise will include long-term residents in the UK does not exclude the inclusion of everyone who lives abroad, notwithstanding how long they are. Now, the reality, as I said, that change has already been made. So the battle we need to fight is easier in the sense that we're not asking for the expansion of the franchise in both directions. It will be in response to a potential change in the franchise in the UK. But I think it is just something that I'm putting on the record as something we'll need to be aware of. My own view, as I say, Europeans' view, is that there is a sufficient link and a sufficient connection that is relevant stakeholding in academic terms in both cases, both based on citizenship for all the reasons, including what we see now unfolding in Israel in terms of evacuations and the need for protection by your own government, but also of course residence based. Yeah, just a short point. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on this. So George wants to come in.
Indeed, I just hi everybody. Just to support Jenny in sort of going further with this, maybe with the new parliament, maybe to wait to the new parliament, maybe unlock democracy as one of the initial acts of welcoming the new MPs and so on. Could touch upon the messaging that comes out, for instance, on automated messaging. When the message goes out, I'm only dealing with my own constituents, otherwise do this, that, or the other. That we try to standardize the response that goes on these automated messages, as well as on the websites of the various MPs, which includes the overseas element, not to forget the overseas element as part of the duty of care they have to their constituents. So simply to say that I think we should prepare ourselves perhaps for some mailings, which include, of course, the websites of members of parliament, the websites of the different local parties, a kind of welcome message that's also, obviously also mentioning the importance of the campaign that we have, and sort of practical steps that they can take to make their constituents overseas feel welcomed, and that they will be dealing with their issues. That's all. Thank you. Just that we should initiate something like that, and perhaps indeed can wait a little bit until the new MPs come in as part of the welcome package that we might send to them. Thank you.
I think it's a good point. I was saying when we were kind of restarting that I think in a way the different points around both trying to tag on to existing campaigns around pensions, the fact that it's difficult for MPs in the UK to be effectively dealing with this, and I think Jenny's very poignant point that actually many of them don't even recognize that it is a duty that they have. I mean, those two are actually linked, because the reality is both of them demonstrate that we've got a problem with the current representational model. And the more overseas constituents there are, arguably the more the problem would arise, right? Because there would be more people who would seek to, if a registration drive is successful, we're going to have many more people on the register. They're going to vote, and then they will expect representation, rightly. And if they don't get it from MPs because they can't or won't, then there'll be a problem. And so in a way, we want to try and preempt that by our proposal, but also in the short term, I think your suggestion of having adding this to the brief for incoming MPs, I think would be very welcome.
Yeah.
I just ask a question, having got at least two British parliamentarians in the same frame, Chris and Tom, or X in my case, but
Yeah. Oh,
if I wanted to have a moan about being told to sling me up as an overseas elector, because it's quite the standards of what's actually what we could do is basically say, well, if you're not getting anywhere, this is who to complain to.
Well, I would suggest whoever their party leader is, whoever the whip.
In terms of Parliament, because for me, I agree that, sorry, Tom, to kind of back across you, but yes, this is a political issue, but this is also an issue of democracy in our Parliament, in the Parliament that is supposed to be representing all, at the very least, all voters, including those living overseas, yeah, whose claim they have standards. Well, if those people aren't living up to those standards, then let's just tickle the we'll have a moan about this into that system as well, because it's a double header, I think.
Well, I think you could certainly complain to the Speaker, because, of course, the Speaker does intervene. When the Speaker thinks that a Member of Parliament is treading on another Member of Parliament's turf in terms of taking up issues for someone else's constituents, the Speaker will respond to that. So this is sort of similar. So someone not representing their constituents, I think the Speaker would be a good place to start. But I was going to say the other places that you should go are to complain to their party leader, saying this person isn't representing me, and complain to the whoever the chief whip for that party is as well, saying the person that you are whipping doesn't do their job. And then, of course, the final thing is if there is any a local paper news locally or a local news website, complain to them and see if they'll pick it up. Chris, do you have anything to add to?
No, I'm sorry, I missed a little bit of that there. I had to
It was how to complain about a MP who doesn't want to take up issues.
Tom would know more about this. Would it be an issue for the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards?
Yeah, exactly. It's about including that in our campaign. I know, as you say, I totally agree with what you said, Tom. Yes, that's all the usual suspects, and good ones at that. Yeah, absolutely. But it seems to me that part also of saying in the job description, it's your job to represent these people, is also to say, and if they're not doing their job, this is how you have a moan about it. Because for the average punter doing what we as political activists, let's face it, that's who we are on this call, are pretty confident about doing as a standard, let's go and have a actually for a lot of people, that won't be an accessible route. There must be surely a way of complaining about an MP not doing their job properly.
But that seems like a wider point as well. It's not specific.
It's
but not specifically about people who live abroad. It's
in a sentence. I know that the Parliamentary Commissioner will not deal with this because we complained to him about Nadine Dorris's failure to be a Member of Parliament. And the Parliamentary Commissioner's response was, I can't hold her to account because MPs do not have a job description. So hence we're trying to get a job description in place. So then perhaps the Parliamentary Commissioner will be able to do something about Nadine Dorris. She's gone, fortunately, or your MP, whoever that is, not representing your interest.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. I'm just conscious Magdalena had their hand up, waiting patiently. So you want to come in, and we also have to finish in about 5 minutes. Yeah.
Hi, I've joined this project quite late. So is there a list of countries that do this for their citizens abroad? And where can I find the information? Because I want to write an article about this. Also, I was born in Hungary, so I'm dual citizen. I'm watching what's happening in Hungary. Orban actually gave and encouraged people living abroad to take on Hungarian citizenship, which changed to a great extent the result of their last election. Some countries are using this in order to gain support from people who might never have been resident in their country, but they have taken up citizenship.
Sure. No, that's right. And ultimately, we were talking earlier that there might be a change coming up in Ireland when it comes to its kind of electoral laws with citizens abroad. And the Irish diaspora is very large. It much surpasses the Irish resident population because of nationality laws. So much of it also relates to how states define nationality and the nationality acquisition when one lives abroad. So that on the second point. But on your first point, we do have in our resources a list. We'll send you the link to. We have a master document for everyone who's involved in a campaign that has both the template letter to the MPs and to others, has campaign materials, has the briefing that we've jointly prepared that explains the rationale, and also has some other relevant information like this. So we of course would be very happy to share this after the meeting. I think we.
I don't know who's still. I know some people had problems joining us. Good to see Clarissa's there. I don't know if you wanted to hear from some of the people who maybe haven't spoken, like Clarissa and Lisa. I know they've often made points about how important UK citizens are as ambassadors for the UK in terms of that this is where.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Did you want to say a little bit about that, Clarissa? Because you've often made that point about how important UK citizens are as ambassadors for the UK, because they are indeed of all different ages and different professions. And
yeah, I mean, when I interviewed one of the Italian MPs for overseas constituents, and he told me it's very much a two-way thing, and that Italian overseas constituents, they feed back very useful information, and they are like ambassadors for Italy all over the world. And there's things like in where I live in Italy that I have first-hand experience of how post-Brexit Italian schools are affected by they can't organise study trips to the UK anymore. And this, of course, affects businesses in the UK. And also we can give feedback based on our experience that, for example, in Italy, English mother tongue teachers changed the way that English is taught in schools. But now the pool of mother tongue teachers is drying up because it's much more difficult for them to come to Italy. So I think, it's a two-way thing, not just representing us, people who can understand our problems, but I think, we have some use in feeding back. And this thing about, many of us remain very strongly linked to the UK. Many of us are bringing business into the UK. And so we're basically just being British somewhere else.
Yeah.
That's it, really.
Yeah, no, and it's a point I actually was going to make earlier. One other aspect of our campaign, I made it implicitly when I said there are people of all ages and of all guises and doing all different things. One of the things that we think will be critical for this campaign is to actually have these testimonials across the different places, the different age groups, the different occupations, so that in a way, a little bit of a misdispelling around what the character of people who are abroad will also, we think, be helpful in persuasion when we come, if and when we come to the stage where we're able to make the case formally in Parliament. Given that we've come to the hour, I think I'll hand over again to Tom. Let's look, do you have anything final to say?
Just one very brief point.
Yeah.
The guy who led much of the campaign to get the franchise extended is this old man in Italy who was thanked repeatedly during the debates for his great effort in raising this. And I just wonder if he might actually turn his attention now the franchise is extended to overseas constituencies, if someone could approach him.
He died early.
Unfortunately.
Oh, you,
Okay.
Yeah,
Too late.
yeah,
102.
Yeah.
yeah,
he was a very good friend of ours, but
I'm afraid
yeah.
that is not an option. But in terms of next steps, so Ruvi has reminded I was going to draft an early day motion, which I can do, and just table that, get a supportive MP to table it and try and generate some other MPs' names on it to identify who our potential supporters might be. I will make sure, as I'm already doing, that in relation to the work that Unlock Democracy is doing around a registration drive and automatic voter registration, that the interests of UK citizens abroad are taken into account as part of that work. I've asked the person who's working on this job description already to include a reference to representing all voters on the electoral register. We are trying to secure this event, which we will host jointly with a foreign MP who is an overseas MP, because I think that's a good way of publicising it. And I think we could invite UK parliamentarians to that, even if they don't come. At least they've been invited and they're aware that there are people who do that, who have that role. And then finally, I think we need to keep an eye on the King's speech. I doubt there's going to be anything in there that is particularly relevant, but who knows, we might be surprised. And so there might be some parliamentary opportunities before this parliament breaks up for a general election on which to hang some things.
Yeah, and perhaps I'll add a sixth, which is we need to also keep an eye as to when the regulations are actually published to the implementation of the Elections Act 2022. And once effectively there is a possibility for people to register irrespective of 15-year bar, I think that gives us the go-ahead for a push on the registration drive.
Yeah.
So I think those are some of the things we'll be sure. Promoting, and for those who are also in the wider campaign group, we'll arrange one of our campaigns meeting in due course. So thanks everyone.
Thank you everyone.
Coming.
Good to see you all.
Coming, and we'll keep in touch.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Bye.